I am Diana Clarion, and I bid you welcome. A couple of hours ago, I was involved in a Facebook conversation with, I believe the pronunciation is Kaine Diatheke. I hope I have that right. I may have been conversing with Dr. Jones himself. If so, I am very honored. The thread of the conversation dealt with a video that aired first yesterday on Contra Apistevism, the indispensability of faith, and I will provide a link to it in the box at the bottom. Now, I was asked to provide some feedback on that video, and after having viewed it 3 times, once yesterday, twice today, the 3rd time scribbling some hasty notes, I hope I can present my position and hopefully open some dialogue, because some of the things I've come to think about with the video, perhaps I am not an apistivist. Perhaps I am using a soft definition of apistivism. Perhaps my definition of faith isn't quite right. These things I would like to discuss and learn about. So I'll try to start from the beginning. There may be some things out of order. I hope I make some sense. There was a mention made of doxastic voluntarism. I'd never heard that term before, but I think I understand the concept. To that I will say that I cannot at all will myself to believe anything, but I must have the beliefs I hold open to revision, at least those beliefs that can be revised, and I'll get to that later. So in a sense, it is perhaps possible that I can will myself to change my mind about a belief, which is, I guess, a different thing than willing myself to hold a belief. There was a mention of selecting sources and possible confirmation bias. Now, this is exactly why I seek out sources contrary to the opinions I hold. For example, this video. Another example is I recently completed Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist? I currently hold myself to be a Jesus mythicist, but I need to know other opinions on the subject, because perhaps I may have it wrong. And at the very least, I've found that it's worth more study on the mythicist question. After I've read the book, I'll read it again. I will go to other sources. So that belief is modifiable in the very least. Now, Ozzy, to me, sounded like he was equating Apistevism and doxastic voluntarism. I'm not quite sure if he did that, but I don't see it that way. I see my apistivism as trying to be cautious, trying to evaluate what I can evaluate before I come to a tentative conclusion, and when I find other evidence, modify that conclusion tentatively until I acquire more evidence and make another modification. Now, I do this because I trained as a mathematician. I trained as a research scientist. The first time at university, I read for a degree in mathematics. So I have some familiarity with formal logic, formal systems of logic, and I use this in my in what I believe on belief. I trained as a research scientist, neuroscience, as a matter of fact. Unfortunately, I fell ill and could not pursue my doctorate, but what of that? As a scientist, again, I must verify. I must also seek opposition. I must be looking to contradict the positions I hold, prove myself wrong, if you will. So that works into my belief system in that manner. Let's see what else we've got. Who was it that mentioned error-tolerant versus error-free? I cannot remember who that was, but again, I know that I will commit errors. That is a fact of life. That is a fact of science. My point is that when I discover that something I personally or formally held was wrong, that must be modified to take into account the new evidence. To me, this distinguishes me and those who may be like me from people like the rank-and-file creationists, or possibly Ken Ham. We'll get to that in a minute. Rank-and-file creationists, at least as I can see, won't necessarily change their belief, and that may be because of fear. And I think Bob and Ozzy addressed that. It may be something they are afraid to reject because of the perceived consequences of rejecting the position. Yes, dear, I know. Sylvia, the cat that has me. You may get to meet her later. But then there are those such as Ham, such as Ray Comfort, such as the so-called creation geologists, who have been presented time and time and time again with evidence that flatly contradicts the view they are advertising. Now, this is important. That they are advertising these views leads me to suspect they may want others to believe what they have to sell while not believing it themselves. I don't know if this is true. I don't know that I can ever verify it, but I at least suspect that. These are the people I thoroughly despise. The people who hold to a belief because they fear rejecting it. Those are another animal entirely. Perhaps they can be convinced that there are no consequences to rejecting the belief, and then they might. And until then, the best any of us can do is try. Nicely, perhaps, but try. Okay, and Dr. Jones' example of the Red Barn, that's something that struck me as rejecting the Red Barn as the Red Barn, because we found out later that it was a Hollywood set that may well be insignificant or even inconsequential. One might decide, okay, this was a Hollywood set, but it still reminded one of that moment, that marriage proposal of which Dr. Jones alluded. So it can still have a significance. Okay, maybe it wasn't a barn, but it was still a reminder of the day. That's not a problem at all. And perhaps it shouldn't be a problem to anyone. Let's see what else we've got here. Ozzy, blind faith, that is exactly what I oppose. And I think I've spoken to that already. I will say it again. Holding to something in the face of flatly contradictory evidence is something I would like to see corrected. If holding to that belief is the result of fear of consequences, we might be able to deal with that. If the refusal to reject the apparent belief that the advertiser might not even hold, that's another story, and that's got to be dealt with in its own way. Now, properly basic beliefs is faith. Here's where I start to get into mathematics. I compare my reasoning to a formal system of logic, as might be seen in mathematics. I know that it is not that exactly, but to me it is similar, and I might be able to use some principles of formal logic in connection with my own beliefs. A formal system of logic consists of theorems, which are well-formed statements according to the grammar of the formal system that are true descriptions of the reality the formal system is attempting to describe. Then there are rules of inference by which the theorems might be combined to produce new theorems. Now, some of these theorems are axioms. They cannot be derived within the formal system, because to attempt to do so would be circular. And I believe that was alluded to in the video. Some of these axioms cannot be justified at all, but must be held in order to even conduct existence. For example, I believe that I exist. I cannot not believe that, because here I am talking to a camera in the hope that someone will see the product. I experience this. There's no way I can prove that I'm not dreaming. There's no way I can prove, well, dreaming, I'll get to that later. There's no way I can prove that I'm not in the Matrix and all of this is a hallucination. But I must hold it in order to do anything. Now, there are also somewhat axiomatic propositions, such as I can trust the evidence of my senses in general. That I will hold as what I call periaxiomatic. It is a statement that very often is taken without justification, but can be refuted. Someone can tell me that the one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater I'm seeing across the hall, I am seeing because I am on drugs, and that is causing me to hallucinate. With a periaxiom like that, one of the things I'll use to help evaluate it is that I am more inclined to believe a statement about my periaxiom that contradicts it than one that reinforces it. The reason is that I'm making the assumption that I would more likely want to hear something with which I agree than something with which I do not agree. So if I am told that this periaxiom that I hold to be true is not, that has to start me to thinking. So these are the bases of my system of thought, and I will proceed from there to make judgments on the world around me based upon evidence I collect. The judgments I make may be incorrect. As a matter of fact, they probably will be incorrect to some degree. Let's face it, almost every proposition of science, aside from its basic axioms, has been refuted at one time or another. Galilean relativity has been superseded by Einsteinian relativity, for example, even though Einsteinian relativity reduces to Galilean relativity at low velocities and can still be used to send people to the moon in certain states, in certain conditions. Galilean relativity simply will not make it. And it goes on from there. So there is the other thing I'm looking at. I am understanding that I must be open to correction based upon new evidence, as I stated earlier in this video. For example, for a long time, I believed that the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, was mostly a matter of states' rights, because that's what I had been taught in middle school. When I was told that that was not correct, my first response was, well, why? And when I was presented with the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stevens, I saw immediately that I was full of crap as far as states' rights and the Civil War was concerned. I had to change my opinion, and I did. So there is an example of how I will use what I find to be my formal system of logic. Something else that came up was justified and unjustified, and rational versus irrational. No, unjustified beliefs are not necessarily irrational because of the concept of axioms. A true axiom cannot be justified at all. It must be accepted. But I don't consider that a matter of faith. I consider that a matter of necessity. Every system of logic needs a starting point, and the axioms are that. Does this mean that my definition of faith needs work? Does that mean that the generally accepted definition of faith needs work? Does that mean that my definition of apistevism or the general definition of apistevism needs work? I'd love to open a dialogue on that. I would love to have some discussion because I think it's worthy of it. Let's see what else. Entitled beliefs. Okay, we're back to axioms again. One is entitled and in fact required to accept axioms in order to do any reasoning at all. And this also flies in the face of people like Seytenbrugg and Kate, Eric Hovind, when they try to go on about using reasoning to justify reasoning. No, that does not happen. One starts with axioms because one simply must. There's no God involved. There's no reasoning these axioms out. It cannot be done. They simply must be accepted. And Bob, I loved your comment on irrational numbers as one excuse me, as one who studied mathematics. That was beautiful. And I guess finally, I do recognize my intellectual limitations. I have to. I have to recognize these limitations because my conclusions from the evidence must be mutable. And if there is some limitation in intellect, and as a matter of fact, I find that there is at least one, then that's going to play a very important part in my reasoning. And as far as the intellectual limitations go, my training in mathematics introduced me to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Some may have heard of this already. I'll try to explain as concisely as I can. In the late 19th, early 20th century, mathematicians were trying to prove mathematics all the way through. And they were arriving at paradoxes, left and right. Some might look up Russell's paradox for one that is very famous. This is a paradox involving classifications of sets. In 1932, I believe, a mathematician by the name of Kurt Gödel formulated and proved a theorem regarding formal systems of logic, of which mathematics is one. In a nutshell, he stated that a formal system can be complete, which is to say that every true statement about the reality the formal system is trying to describe is a theorem of that formal system. A formal system can also be consistent, which is to say that every theorem of a formal system of logic is a true statement about the reality that the system attempts to describe. The difference is subtle, very significant. Basically, consistency is having all of the answers. Okay, wait a minute. Did I say consistency? Completeness is having all of the answers. Consistency is not having all of the answers, but being assured that the answers you do have are valid. And as I see it, to the extent that one can apply Gödel's theorems to human reasoning, and it's a stretch, I understand, religion attempts completeness, while reason attempts consistency. I favor consistency. And this goes back to my wish to not accept any, at high level at least, if I can use the term, propositions on faith alone. And by high level, I mean, propositions that can be reasoned out. So, perhaps I am not an apistivist. If I am not, I will accept that. Do I have a choice? Perhaps I am an apistivist by a soft definition of apistevism. Perhaps something with a bit more flexibility than Aaron Ra may have, for example. Perhaps my definition of faith is not quite the correct definition of faith. Perhaps the generally accepted definition of faith is not quite correct. I would love to have a discourse on this, and I would welcome any invitation to do so. So, again, I am Diana Clarion, and I thank you kindly.